Hello again. This is the lecture for chapter 27. I think it's going to be in two parts actually. The first part is going to deal with uh, sort of American affluence, the creation of the suburbs, and that kind of middle class, uh, lily white 1950s America kind of picture. And then the second half of the lecture is going to deal with the parts of 1950 America that we that wasn't sort of part of that mainstream American dream image, that suburban image. We'll talk about sort of rural poverty. We'll talk about um, ethnic minorities, the beginnings of the civil rights movement, and the kind of beat movement, and that sort of teenage rebellious type movement that we kind of touched on in class. So that's going to be the division of these two lectures. Um, yeah, and I guess we'll go ahead and get started. The picture here I want to draw your attention to especially. It's an advert actually for a submarine which says it fires rockets and torpedoes over 7 feet long, big enough for 2 kids. And you can get it for only $6.98, as far as I can tell. I'm not entirely sure if this is meant to be for real or if this is meant to be a joke, but it's an interesting idea to be faced with, especially considering how pervasive the Cold War was. And in fact, the sort of main theme of this lecture rather is going to be talking about how pervasive the Cold War was, and just how many different areas of American life the war influenced. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. Okay, so one of the things that was quite defining, at least for 1950s America, was the level of kind of affluence that American society managed to reach following the Second World War. By the end of the decade, by 1960, roughly 60% of American families owned their own homes, about 75% owned cars, about 87% owned at least one television, and many of them owned more than one. Government spending, combined with a huge sort of upsurge in productivity, steadily increasing consumer demand, rather, which fed into that increase in productivity. All of this served to push the gross national product up by over 50% in the decade of the 50s. By 1960, the average worker's income was reflecting these gains. It was about 35% higher than it was in 1945. The United States produced and consumed nearly half of everything that was made and sold on the entire planet. And so it speaks a lot to our just the level of economic affluence that the U.S. had managed to achieve. Federal spending constituted a huge source of economic growth. Federal spending nearly doubled during the 50s, up to about $180 billion. These funds were used to fund projects like building roads, airports, financing home mortgages, supporting farm prices, providing stipends for education. More than half the federal budget, however, roughly 10% of the overall gross national product, was devoted to defense spending, which goes to illustrate that connection to the Cold War, the fact that was going on. And it almost seemed in Western countries, especially in the US, as if the Second World War never ended, because that level of spending and that level of kind of intimately intertwined industrial military complex hadn't diminished following the cessation of hostilities. Government spending transformed entirely the sort of mythic Western frontier in America. It's now a West full of bureaucrats and defense contractors and scientists, and research and development type areas, and all of them dependent on federal funds. So you no longer have this sort of independent Western rugged individualist. It's all kind of the government now, which is funding the West essentially. Government funding and control also transformed the U.S. military and the U.S. industry. The nation's first nuclear power plant, for example, came online in 1957, and it was financed by the Atomic Energy Commission, which was created as a kind of bureaucracy within the government, and it utilized Navy scientists in order to get that plant up and running. The chemical industry also continued its wartime growth, and instead of chemical weapons, they're now producing plastics and pesticides and other things like that, as well as new fabrics like nylon and Dacron and stuff like that, which people had never really sort of seen before. Electricity consumption also tripled in the 50s, and electronics became the fifth largest industry in America as factories began to automate and consumers were purchasing all manner of electric appliances, anything from small home appliances to televisions to various electrical appliances. This was sort of the new wave of technology. Domestic oil production and foreign oil imports also rose very steeply in this decade, and by 1960, oil had replaced coal as the nation's main energy source. Gasoline in the period was plentiful and cheap, and it fed the growth of the automobile industry and the aircraft industries, which saw huge booms in the decade of the 50s as well. The computer was key to this sort of technological revolution that we undergo in the 1950s. In 1944, you have the production of the Mark I calculator, which had about 500 miles of wiring. And so calculator is sort of an interesting term to us, I suppose, from our modern perspective, where a calculator can fit in the palm of your hand. And this one had trouble fitting in a reasonably small room. But it was devised by, or for the military rather, in late 1945 in order to improve the accuracy of artillery shells. You also have, following that, the development of operating instructions. Printed circuits for wires followed in 1948. Solid-state transistors, all these things unfolding out of that first large, cumbersome Mark I calculator. The sales of electronic computers to industry rose from about 20 in 1954 to more than 1,000 by 1957, a relatively short period of just 3 years, and more than 2,000 in 1960, so doubles in the next 3 years. Major manufacturers used computers to monitor production lines, to track inventory, to ensure quality control, and in government, computers were also used largely in departments like in the Pentagon for strategists as they were sort of working out their war games. They were used by the Census Bureau and Internal Revenue Service as well. The development of high technology complex, known as Silicon Valley in California, began in 1951 when Stanford University utilized its science and engineering facilities to design and produce the Fairchild semiconductor for Hewlett-Packard companies, which commissioned it. This kind of relationship between universities and technological corporations also became the sort of model that was followed by successive high-tech firms in the area as well. And you also see similar areas pop up in other locations. Another one outside of Boston, there's another outside of Austin, Texas, which also popped up as sort of technological corporate centers. All of these rapid technological advances accelerated the growth and the power of big business. The wealthiest became sort of oligopolies who swallowed up all of their weaker competitors and mergers and simply buying them out. Corporations acquired overseas facilities to become multinational corporations. They also formed conglomerates by merging various unrelated industries into one giant sort of parent company, much like we have companies like Time Warner, one of those sort of giant companies like that, conglomerates. The growth and consolidation meant a greater amount of bureaucratization as well. So instead of capitalists like we have in our earlier periods of industrialization and development, we now have executives. And success in these new industries required conformity rather than creativity, and teamwork rather than individuality. And so you see, it kind of matches the overall sort of theme of the 1950s, this idea of conformity and consensus is prevalent in business as well. Despite, or not exclusive, those sort of problems with the structure of business, you also get changes in agriculture which parallel those changes in industry. Farming grows increasingly scientific and mechanized. Technology cuts working hours in half as far as growing crops, and it causes a lot of farm families to migrate to the cities to give up their family farms in favor of the big corporate agribusiness type farms. You also get the implementation and the use of various chemicals like DDT, which is now been outlawed, actually, the use of DDT. The line that I have here on the slide, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. It's actually a line, you may have heard the song, Counting Crows did a cover of it back in the 90s. I don't know, you may have heard it from your parents or someone like that. But it's originally a Joni Mitchell song, and she wrote it back in the 70s. Whenever you have a lot of environmental protests in the 70s. The 70s are the decade that produced the Clean Air Act and the act which creates the EPA. And she makes a reference in that song where she says something about she's not worried about spots on her apples, but leave me the birds and the bees. And she makes a reference to the use of farmers or the use by farmers of chemicals like DDT, which has now been found to be somewhat harmful to us. So you kind of get the atmosphere which creates the environmental protests in later decades here, as well as part of the cost of these big businesses. Consolidation also transformed the labor movement considerably. In 1955, the merger of the two larger groups, the AFL and the CIO, brought about 85% of union members into one single labor union. Organized labor fell victim, however, to its successes. They managed to bargain for higher wages, for shorter work weeks, paid vacations, healthcare coverage, wage hikes that were tied to the cost of living, and all of these successes led a lot of workers to view themselves as middle class rather than a working class. And so it sort of saps the militancy out of labor unions. By 1956, for the first time in U.S. history, white-collar employees actually outnumber blue-collar workers. And although most service jobs were just as routine as any factory job was, there were very few unions who actually sought to incorporate white-collar workers into their unions. And so the percentage of the labor force that was unionized falls pretty steadily throughout the decade. So lots of new developments in the 1950s. The prevalence of things like installment buying, home mortgages, auto loans, all of this triples America's private debt in the 1950s. And in its effort to convince people to buy what they didn't need, businesses spend a lot more on things like advertising. than the nation did on things like public schools. Um, Americans were urged constantly to buy now, pay later, and they purchased about 58 million new cars during the 1950s as a result of all of these urgings, I suppose, by manufacturers, government policy, as well as the sort of craze for bigger and better automobiles with more impressive features, spurred white Americans, anyways, to abandon the inner cities in droves and move out into the suburbs. Federal spending on highways skyrocketed during the decade, and it put areas that were once difficult to manage for people who worked in cities, it put them within commuting distance, especially as more and more people had cars. And so the temptation was to move out there. The income tax code also stimulated home sales by allowing deductions for home mortgage interest payments and for property taxes, so it encouraged people to buy new homes, and most of the new homes for sale were in the suburbs. Organizations like the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration offered low-interest loans, which further encouraged that movement outward. Both of them, however, continued to deny loans to Black Americans who sought to buy homes in white neighborhoods. In 1960, American suburbia was like 98% white because of these kind of policies. Two gentlemen, Alfred and William Levitt, decided to utilize, or capitalize rather, I suppose is a better word, on this mass exodus from the big cities. They used mass production construction techniques that they had perfected during the war era industry in order to build standardized 720 square foot homes as quickly as possible. And all 17,000 or so of these homes looked exactly like. You can see a picture there, a bird's eye view picture of your typical, rather interesting suburban outlay. 85% of the 13 million new homes that were built in the 1950s were in suburbs, much like the one pictured here. And about 20 million Americans moved into these suburbs during that decade. There were a lot of critics who decried the multitude of uniform, unidentifiable houses lined up inflexibly and at uniform distances on uniform roads and in treeless communal wastelands inhabited by people all of the same class, same income, and same age group, which is a rather long quote from a gentleman called Lewis Mumford. But suburbia remained, at least for that decade and into the next decades as well, the quintessential image of the American dream. For most families who longed for their own home, good schools, safe streets, and neighbors like themselves, the suburbs were the ultimate lure, as they provided all of those things to those people. Americans also moved to different regions. They moved south and west into the Sun Belt, lured by job opportunities, the nicer climate, and the somewhat slower pace of life. Industry also headed south and west. They were drawn by low tax policies in southern and western states, low energy costs, anti-union right-to-work laws, which pervaded southern and western states, You also have a fair number of senior citizens that decamped and moved to nicer climates in places like Florida and Southern California. And all of these, the businesses, the white middle class, and the senior citizens brought with them a much more conservative outlook. And so you see the politics of the South and the West beginning to shift a little bit because of that influx as well. It wasn't everyone, though, that embraced the conformity of the 1950s sort of consumer culture, as the quote earlier by Mr. Mumford would lead us to believe. Intellectuals found an audience for their attack on organization men bent on getting ahead and going along, pursuing external rewards to compensate for internal insecurities and those sorts of things. One critic, a man called Reisman, described modern Americans as shaped by the opinions of their peers rather than by their own consciences. And some took aim at this sort of consumerist characteristic of the American middle class. The criticism often oversimplified the reality. It tended to ignore any ethnic or class diversity. It tended to ignore the fact that earlier generations were just as acquisitive as the current generation was. If we remember the massive consumerism of the 1920s and earlier generations, it's really nothing new, this level of consumerism. Even going all the way back to like the 1830s, we have a sort of wave of consumerism sweeping through America. So the criticism tended to ignore those kinds of facts. They also tended to ignore the fact that dissent was not terribly far from the surface in 1950s America, but it did rightly hit on the elevation of comfort over challenge and private pleasures over public affairs or even the public interest. And so in that way, the critics were spot on. Finally, in the 1950s, you have, after years of separation and loss, which were defined by the years of the Second World War, Americans longed for some kind of emotional security as well as material success and looked to family as their source of stability in a rather unstable world. In 1954, McCall's magazine coined the term togetherness in order to celebrate the ideal couple, an ideal couple who centered their lives on home and children, family. Americans in the 1950s tended to marry young, to have babies rather quickly, and to have more babies than previous generations did. The number of children per family in the 1950s actually rose from the standard 2.4 to 3.2 children per family. New medical things or medical developments, I suppose, like antibiotics, were able to subdue illnesses like diphtheria and whooping cough that often plagued younger generations. The Salk and Sabine vaccines ended the dreaded disease polio, as far as we know. And so the decline in childhood mortality also helped to raise American life expectancy and led to about a 19% population spurt during the 1950s as a result of all these sort of medical developments. Again, most of them triggered by innovations during the war. The sheer size of the baby boom generation, meaning Americans born roughly between the years of 1946 and 1964 or 65-ish. Over 70 million Americans born during this time period. The sheer size of it meant that the impact of this generation would have historical importance. So the whole country essentially goes through the major life events with the baby boomers. So in the 1940s, early 1940s and 50s, you have a boom in things like baby carriages and nurseries because the baby boomers are all babies. That eventually gives way to school construction as the baby boom generation all began going to school, and classrooms are actually in short supply. In the 1960s, college enrollments grew as the baby boomers were graduating high school and going to college. In the 70s, baby boomers were beginning to have their own families, and so new home construction was peaking during that period as that generation were buying homes for their families. And in the 1980s and 1990s, you have a surge in retirement investments. And this century, in the 21st century, we have a sort of preoccupation with things like Medicare and health insurance for the elderly especially, as the baby boomers are now properly retired and looking for benefits that one who is retired looks for. So essentially, we've had the whole nation has grown up with the baby boomers because the generation is so large as a result of this. No one did quite as much to emphasize the sort of proper way to bring up a child in the 1950s as did one particular individual, a man called Dr. Benjamin Spock. Not the Dr. Spock that we maybe know and love from the television, but a different one. His book, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, I believe was probably even the foundation of my own upbringing, as I do believe my mom has it in her bookcase. And it was sort of the Bible of child rearing in the 1950s, 60s, and so on, well into the next several decades. In his book, Dr. Spock urges mothers not to work outside the home in order to create an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy for their children. Crying babies were not meant to cry it out. They were meant to be comforted. And you also see practices like breastfeeding coming back into vogue as per the recommendations of Dr. Spock. The post-war emphasis on family and togetherness also renewed the idea of separate spheres, if you like, domesticity as the defining and rather constraining role of women. Popular culture took every opportunity to glorify marriage and parenthood. As I mentioned while we were in class, the Leave It to Beaver 1950s housewife, sort of perfect housewife. Education also reinforced all these notions. Again, as I mentioned in class, girls were encouraged to study typing and cooking and cautioned not to miss the boat on marriage and family by pursuing education. There were profound changes sort of taking place just beneath the surface. In 1960, about 1/3 of the labor force was female, and about 1 out of every 3 married women were also working outside the home. So despite the urging for women to be stay-at-home moms and housewives, you still have a considerable part of the female population who is working outside the home either out of necessity or desire to do so. Most of the women who worked outside the home worked in order to augment family income, not necessarily to challenge stereotypes. They often held jobs referred to as pink-collar jobs. In the service industry, they were secretaries or clerks or waitresses and so on. The median wage was less than half of what men were able to make. But despite these setbacks, the ability to work outside the home developed a sense of expectation and empowerment in the women who did, and they were able to pass that down to their daughters, and it was their daughters that would fuel the feminist movement that would become prominent in the 60s and 70s later on. In 1954, Time magazine made the claim that the Christian faith is back in the center of things. You have well-known evangelists like Billy Graham coming to the fore in the 1950s. He and others like him all had syndicated newspaper columns, they wrote best-selling books, they had radio or television programs, and each one promoted a mixture of religious salvation and anti-communism quite aggressively. Hollywood religious extravaganzas, were the biggest box office hits of the 1950s. And while television pronounced that the family that prays together stays together, you also have Congress stepping in. It's in the 1950s that a law is passed which adds the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. And as I mentioned last week, revamped the national motto of the United States from E Pluribus Unum to In God We Trust and added it to all of the currency. While church membership may have doubled in this decade, of the 1950s, intensity of faith tended to diminish for some, especially as mainstream churches tended to downplay the effects of sin and evil and preached a kind of nationalist message, Americanism and fellowship. However, you still have sort of millions of others outside of mainstream American religion who embraced various evangelical fundamentalist ideas. These were your born-again Christians at the time. Similarly, as sort of religious involvement is escalating in the United States, education also swells in the 1950s, and yet seemed to be, for some at least, less rigorous than in previous decades. You have various progressive, in quotations I suppose, educators who promoted sociability and self-expression rather than the retention of hard facts or science and history and things like that. Well-rounded students became much more highly prized than highly skilled or intelligent students. Surveys of college students found them to be fairly conservative, conformist, and career-orientated, and this creates what becomes known as a silent generation of college students. Normally, your colleges are where you find the free thinkers and the dissenters in any given society. And the 1950s produces a unusual college generation, those who are more concerned with security and comfort than with challenging the status quo. It's back to business as normal by the 1960s. Colleges become much less conformist, and college students become much less so as well. But in the 1950s, they definitely go against the grain in that sense. Very few university faculty challenged the reigning thought of the day, which probably explains why college students weren't as challenging as they have been in previous decades or as they will be in future decades. Historians tended to downplay class conflicts and highlight pragmatism of Americans, and consensus was generally the accepted idea that provoked education, or that defined education. You also see, as I mentioned, at least in one class, new emphasis placed on the study of science and technology. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite into orbit, a satellite called Sputnik, which was Russian for little traveler. Sputnik pretty much dashed any idea that America was unquestionably technologically superior to the Soviet Union, as we had been beaten into the upper atmosphere anyways. The Eisenhower administration disparaged the Soviet accomplishment in public, but behind the scenes pushed to have America launch its own missile carrying a satellite into orbit. We did so on December 6th, but it ended up being more of a national embarrassment than anything else, as it got all of 6 feet into the air and then exploded quite spectacularly. And so it didn't really have the desired effect, as you may be able to infer. Eisenhower then responded by more than doubling the funds for missile development and the establishment of the Science Advisory Committee, whose recommendations eventually led to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. We did manage to launch several sort of probes into space and successfully tested intercontinental ballistic missiles by the end of the decade. Motivated by the launch of Sputnik, Americans also embarked on a program to improve American education, and this resulted in the National Defense Education Act. For the first time, direct federal funding was provided to induce students to pursue higher education in areas like the sciences, mathematics, and foreign languages, seen as a way of essentially fighting the Cold War on a different front. Last but not least, we will talk about movies and TV. American culture tended to reflect both the spirit and prosperity of the 1950s, but also the Cold War anxiety that was prevalent in the 1950s. Americans spent about 1/7 of the gross national product on entertainment. Spectator sports were particularly popular. You have new symphony halls opening up, and book sales doubled as well. The major novels of the era tended to be characterized by introspection and improvisation. Popular writers like Salinger and Updike presented characters with sort of vaguely dissatisfied with their jobs and with their houses, with their homes, longing for some kind of existence that's more vital or more authentic, but incapable of any real decisive action in order to make that happen. Hollywood also reflected a kind of diminished interest in politics, which is prevalent throughout American entertainment. They turned out quite a lot of westerns, musicals, costume spectacles. Most films about contemporary life portrayed Americans as one giant happy white, middle-class, suburban family. Minorities and the poor remained largely invisible, and women remained largely stuck in the archetype of the sort of dumb blonde, if you like, or cute helpmate, but their roles tended to lack any real substance. The main medium, though, that people used for entertainment was television more so than anything, and as TV became more popular, movie attendance began dropping pretty substantially as well. About 1/5 of the nation's movie theaters closed down or were converted into other things, bowling alleys, supermarkets, and the like. No other cultural medium managed to grow quite so quickly or to grow to become quite so big as the television did. In 1946, about 1 in every 18,000 households had a television set, but by 1960, 9 out of every 10 households had at least one TV, and a lot of Americans had more televisions than they had bathrooms in their house. Businesses capitalized on the phenomenon. You have 3 main radio networks that operated in previous decades, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and they gobbled up quite a lot of the TV stations in the country, profited again by selling time to advertisers, much like they did in the radio. TV Guide soon became the most popular periodical in the country, as it was able to tell everyone exactly what shows they could expect to watch in a given week. TV dinners served to alter the nation's eating habits, as people tended to not eat dinner around the table, but rather eat dinner in front of the television on off of trays. Initially, television programs tended to showcase talent and creativity, but as the price of TV sets came down, and you have the spread of things like McCarthyism and other sort of negativity, networks began to change their programming. It became much more lighthearted and much more like a celebration of the conformity and consumerism that was prevalent throughout American middle-class society. Controversy, basically, went out of vogue and off the air. In the 1960s, the head of the Federal Communications Commission described TV as a vast wasteland, sort of decrying its mediocrity. But while that argument may have some merit, it's undeniable that the television had quite a impact on American society, but measuring the impact is somewhat difficult. Although TV tended to tie into the status quo, it did raise expectations of others. It functioned both as a conservator of mainstream American culture, but also as a spur to change. In the main, however, it generally reflected existing values and institutions and reinforced gender and racial stereotypes that were already prevalent in American society. It tended to extol male violence and fighting evil and portray women as either, crazy madcaps like Lucy and I Love Lucy, or self-effacing moms like the mom in Leave It to Beaver. Television also tended to change political life. Politicians could now effectively appeal to a much broader section of the population over the heads of party leaders, and so it fundamentally changes the way American politics rolls out. Instead of Americans being much more tied to a party which then endorses a candidate, candidates can appeal directly to American voters, and so now we have a system to where we watch individual candidates debate on TV, and we consider people almost with less regard to the party they are attempting to represent or proposing to represent. Overall, television helped to produce a much more national, much more homogenized culture. It diminished the importance of provincialism or regionalism because you had national networks and national programs. It massively increased the cost of political campaigning while also decreasing the content of political discussion. And it also overwhelmingly portrayed the rather contented citizenry and reinforced complacency, but also served to hide that other part of America, that part of America that's sort of pushed into the background behind the scenes. And it's that other part of America that will be the main topic of our discussion in the next lecture. So come back for that one.